Nonviolence and the transformative power of love. These have been the lifelong anchors for Pamela Chatterton-Purdy and David Purdy as they played their part in advocating for social justice in America. They experienced hatred and racism directly in the communities where they raised their biracial family, and they responded by promoting integration and understanding. In the past decade, they went on to create a lasting tribute to civil rights icons throughout American history, a tribute that carries important information and insights as relevant today as ever. They continue to tour the country, presenting their landmark exhibition, Icons of the Civil Rights Movement, honoring heroic figures of all races and faiths, famous and not. Past and present. The first work created in the series memorializes Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose leadership brought the civil rights movement to national attention in the 1950s and 60s. Dr. King challenged America to turn from fear and hatred and live up to its better self. Dr. King knew that better self. He also knew the failures of individual character and leadership and the economic and social factors that, in a tug-of-war throughout American history, have often brought America's lesser self to the fore.
In 1963, my husband David, who's right there, we were married in 1963, and that August, the March on Washington occurred. We moved to Chicago, where David was part of the Ecumenical Institute. He is now a retired Methodist minister. In Chicago, I was looking for a job. I graduated with a degree in art, and I'm the one that ended up doing these civil rights icons. I was looking for a job, and I was on the subway, and I saw this beautiful Ebony magazine poster with a beautiful white line drawing of Frederick Douglass. It was a centennial edition. Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. This was 1963. That September, the 16th Street Baptist Church was bombed, killing 4 little girls. It was a horrible, horrible tragedy. A few months later, our civil rights president, John F. Kennedy, is assassinated. We later had 2 biological daughters, and we adopted 2 African-American sons. One of them was actually from Saigon. The fall of Saigon happened in '75, and he was half Vietnamese and half black. We experienced personally racism. Not in Mississippi, we were living in Massachusetts. Later on, my husband and I went on a sojourn to the South, to all the iconic areas of the civil rights movement. And we were with 100 high schoolers on this sojourn trip. And we ended up on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. By then I was in tears, standing on the same spot where Martin Luther King had been assassinated. I had determined right then and there that I would do this series. As an artist, this was my way of speaking for these people who should never be forgotten.
Pam, when I met her, she was so dedicated to her work, and her story was so fascinating to me. This has been all good for our museum.
The icons are very significant for a number of reasons. They tell of a historical period in American history that in most times it was left out of the history books. The collection that is brought here shows visitors the seriousness of the people who participated. The icons vary. They are not just black people, they're everybody, because everybody participated in the civil rights movement. It did not happen with a young Martin Luther King going to Montgomery to defend people who were involved in a bus boycott. But it continued right to the election of Barack Obama.
But I'm finding the amazing gifts that artists have, such as Pam Purdy and the icons of the civil rights movement. When I first saw those, I was just totally amazed at the quality of craftsmanship, but also the importance of her ideas and being able to project them.
The earliest hero in the series is Jeffrey Brace, an enslaved person whose story gives a window into the brutal reality of slavery in the United States. Brace was first sent to Barbados, where he was starved, whipped, and tortured into submission. He was later sold to an American sea captain, trained as a soldier sailor, and fought with distinction during the 7 Years' War. He was then sold to a succession of owners and subjected to beatings, made to eat on the floor with dogs, and subjected to other cruelty. He eventually became a servant to a widow in Connecticut who treated him humanely and taught him to read and write. Brace served our country in the Revolutionary War and won a badge of merit, and was ultimately granted his freedom. He became a powerful voice for the abolitionist movement in New England and the author of an important first-hand narrative on slavery in America. Frederick Douglass has been called the father of the civil rights movement. He was born into slavery in Maryland and escaped in 1818. With the friendship of William Lloyd Garrison, he rose to prominence in his own right as an orator on the abolitionist speaking circuit, where he recounted his suffering under slavery and his flight to freedom in the North. During the Civil War, Douglass met with President Abraham Lincoln at the White House, where he urged the president to work more swiftly on black emancipation and the recruitment of black men for the Union Army. After the Civil War and up to his death in 1895, he continued the battle for equal rights for African Americans and voting rights for women. President Abraham Lincoln responded to the secession of the southern states and their attack on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, by going to war to save the Union. As thousands of slaves fled the South and joined with the invading Union forces, President Lincoln became convinced that abolition was morally justifiable. On January 1, 1863, the president issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed the slaves in the 10 rebellious states of the South and allowed former slaves to serve with pay in the Union Army. It also made the abolition of slavery in the United States an explicit goal of the war. At the beginning of his second term, Lincoln pressed Congress to pass an amendment banning slavery throughout the United States and its territories. By December 1865, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified by a sufficient number of states. William Lloyd Garrison was born in 1805 in Newburyport, Massachusetts. He began his own newspaper, The Liberator, in 1830, which promoted the cause of abolition, and he organized the American Anti-Slavery Society. Frederick Douglass and Garrison toured together, giving anti-slavery speeches in the Appalachian region of the country. Though a lifelong pacifist, Garrison did support Abraham Lincoln and his Civil War policy. At his funeral in 1879, Frederick Douglass eulogized, "The brightest and steadiest of all the shining hosts of our moral sky has silently and peacefully descended below the distant horizon." In 1844, Captain Jonathan Walker of Harwich, Massachusetts, attempted to take 7 slaves from Florida to freedom in the British islands of the Caribbean. He was arrested, tried, and imprisoned for a year in Pensacola, Florida. In compliance with the Territory of Florida's law, Walker's right hand was branded with a hot iron with the letters SS to indicate slave stealer. When he was released from prison, Walker joined the abolitionist lecture circuit. He was hailed as a hero by William Lloyd Garrison and was the subject of John Greenleaf Whittier's poem, The Man with the Branded Hand. He was inducted into the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum in Petersboro, New York, in October 2014. This work was unveiled for the first time on Martin Luther King Day in 2008, 40 years after Dr. King's assassination, and it focuses our minds, as if through a window, on a person whose life was an instrument for the correction of injustice and the promotion of freedom.
How important he continues to be. His voice, we still hear his voice literally, and it still moves us as it should, because the direction he's pointing us is a way we all have to walk, or we're not going to make it. We must learn to love one another or perish.
Pamela Purdy went on to create additional icons featuring individual portraits and symbols of particular events and achievements. Together, these icons tell the story of the civil rights movement through the lives of individual heroes, people of all races, faiths, and walks of life, famous and not, and in fact, children as well as adults. In 1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old child from Chicago, visited his uncle in Money, Mississippi. One fateful remark to a store clerk, and Emmett was dragged from his uncle's house, tortured and murdered, a 75-pound cotton gin barbed wired to his neck, his body thrown in the Tallahatchie River. Rosa Parks famously refused to go to the back of the bus. She, Reverend Martin Luther King, and Reverend Ralph Abernathy began the Montgomery bus boycott. Black people walked for 382 days rather than suffer the humiliation of second-class citizenship. Reverend Abernathy was Martin Luther King's best friend throughout the movement. After the Montgomery bus boycott, Abernathy's house and church were bombed. Still, Abernathy, King, and the other leaders of the movement insisted that any protests remain nonviolent. It was Abernathy who cradled King's body on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel on that tragic day in 1968 when King was assassinated.
Anyone who considers learning something new about this, reacting, getting in touch with their own reactions about it, their world will get bigger, and we need to, as a human race, get bigger in our worlds in order to love one another, in order to develop human community in this world. There's no other way. There's no other way.
In addition to Rosa Parks and other individual women, African American women as a group are also honored in the icons. Here we see Septima Clark, Dorothy Height, and Ella Baker, three among the thousands of dedicated workers and powerful voices in the movement. Dorothy Height was born in Pennsylvania in 1912 and lived to the age of 96, long enough to stand with Barack Obama at his inauguration in 2009.
It's history that walks through this door. Many, many people have ties to many of these icons from all over the country, and it's just so amazing that they come in here and tell their story.
I immensely enjoy and celebrate the work of Pamela Purdy. She's made a contribution to art history, but she's also made a contribution to American history.
Pamela and David Purdy met Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth in person in 2004. On Christmas morning in 1956, Shuttlesworth's house in Birmingham, Alabama was bombed. Yet in less than a week, he was out protesting again. Reverend Joseph Lowery co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Martin Luther King, and with Rosa Parks and King, Lowery was instrumental in organizing the Montgomery bus boycott. He gave the eulogy at Coretta Scott King's funeral and the benediction at Barack Obama's first inauguration in 2009. One of the Little Rock Nine, Minnie Jean Brown, told the Purdys of her personal struggle as she went to school that day in 1957. The hatred, the name-calling, the assaults. Though Brown versus Board of Education had ruled in 1954 that segregated schools were unconstitutional, Governor Orville Faubus withdrew the state's National Guard, exposing the students to violence. An early experience of institutionalized racism in his native Mississippi inspired James Meredith to commit himself to equal rights for African Americans. Riding on a train from Chicago with his brother, he was ordered to give up his seat and move to the crowded black section where he had to stand for the rest of the long trip home. Emboldened by the Supreme Court's 1954 ruling against segregated public education and by JFK's inaugural address, Meredith decided to apply to the University of Mississippi. He was denied admission because of his race, and when he sued, the district court ruled against him. The Supreme Court ultimately ruled in Meredith's favor, but nevertheless, university officials, Governor Ross Barnett, Mississippi politicians, and state troopers joined forces to refuse him entrance to the school. President Kennedy ordered over 500 federal agents to enforce Meredith's rights and protect him from threats of being lynched. On October 1, 1961, James Meredith was allowed to register, and riots ensued for several days. Meredith required federal protection until he graduated in 1964. During his march against fear in 1966, he was in fact shot by a sniper. He survived and later earned a degree in economics at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria and a law degree at Columbia University in New York. Reverend Lawson was expelled from Vanderbilt University for his work in training students in nonviolent practices, and he was jailed for participation in the Freedom Rides. The artist unveiled this icon in the presence of Lawson himself at the Boston University School of Theology in 2011.
Reverend Lawson, you have no idea how thrilling it is for me to meet you, a living icon of the civil rights movement. I have recreated an icon in your honor.
Thanks a lot to artist Pamela Purdy for this icon and for her thoughtfulness in doing it and presenting it this evening. That's a picture of me in the Jackson, Mississippi City Jail.
Julian Bond, a strong exponent of the power of nonviolence in the pursuit of social change, played an important role in the civil rights movement throughout the 1950s and 60s and long beyond. As a student at Morehouse College, he joined others in organizing the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, whose activities led directly to the integration of Atlanta's theaters, parks, and restaurants. In the spring of 1960, Bond and fellow students collaborated in founding the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he led voter registration drives throughout the South on behalf of SNCC. An eloquent Spokesperson for the ongoing struggle for human rights, Bond served in the Georgia State Legislature and State Senate, and as chair of the NAACP, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, narrator of the landmark PBS documentary Eyes on the Prize, host of America's Black Forum, and distinguished professor in residence at American University, among other academic posts. In 1960, 4 students from North Carolina A&T College in Greensboro sat down at a lunch counter in a Woolworth store and asked to be served. Franklin McCain, David Richmond, Ezell Blair, and Joseph McNeil sat there daily for 6 months and were refused service. With courage and perseverance, these young people continued in their nonviolent protest, spawning sit-ins and boycotts around the country and changing American history forever.
One can't see the Holy Spirit, but you can feel it. But in some ways you can see it. And in this one particular incident where these sit-ins at Nashville occurred, there were waves of people sitting at the counter. They would sit there, they would ask to be served. Some of them would get cigarettes put out on their heads, pitchers of sugar and creamer poured on them, mustard, ketchup. They would be dragged off to jail. But the next wave of the Holy Spirit would sit in their places and take the abuse. They would be dragged off, and the next wave would come. The Holy Spirit doesn't quit, doesn't give up. The enduring tolerance and work that the Holy Spirit does for justice blows me away.
After graduating from Hamilton College, earning an MA at Harvard, and teaching mathematics at the prestigious Horace Mann School in New York, Robert Parris Moses went to Atlanta to work with Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. After decades of disenfranchisement under Mississippi's voting rules, Black people no longer even tried to vote. Moses worked to educate and register voters, and he was harassed, beaten, and arrested for his efforts. In September 1961, a white legislator, E.H. Hurst, killed Herbert Lee, a local farmer who had driven Moses from farm to talk about voter rights. Hurst was cleared of charges on the claim of self-defense. A Black man, Lewis Allen, had witnessed Lee's killing, and he later came forward to testify to federal authorities that he had seen the legislator force Lee out of his truck and shoot him in the head. Knowing that Allen himself now lived in danger of his life, Bob Moses appealed to the Justice Department for Allen's protection. But in the end, Lewis Allen was also murdered. Moses continued his voter education and registration work through the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, which brought many white college students from the North to Mississippi. In 1964, 3 of these young civil rights workers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were reported missing and were later found murdered. Still, under Bob Moses' calm leadership, the volunteers persevered. With Fannie Lou Hamer, Moses became one of the originators of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that successfully drew attention to inequities when they challenged the all-white state delegation on the floor of the Democratic National Convention. Bob Moses later returned to Harvard to complete his PhD in the philosophy of mathematics. In 1982, he received a MacArthur Foundation Genius Award and used it to promote the Algebra Project, a national program he developed to improve math skills of children in poor communities. Key figures in the Nashville student movement, C.T. Vivian, Diane Nash, and Bernard Lafayette, were all strongly influenced by Reverend James Lawson, who taught Gandhi's nonviolent direct action strategy to this influential group. C.T. Vivian was studying for the ministry at Nashville's American Baptist College, and he mentored Lawson students, including Diane Nash, Bernard Lafayette, James Bevel, John Lewis, and others, in creating a systematic, nonviolent sit-in campaign. In April 1960, 4,000 demonstrators marched on City Hall, where Vivian and Nash challenged Nashville Mayor Ben West on the issue of racial discrimination. Diane Nash emerged as one of the outstanding civil rights leaders of the 1960s and clearly expressed her willingness to give her life to the cause. She helped guide the sit-ins in Nashville and the freedom rides throughout the South. With students from black colleges and universities, Nash was one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960, when violent attacks in Alabama threatened the continuation of the freedom rides organized by the Congress of Racial Equality. She convinced SNCC to sponsor the rides. A representative of U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy tried to dissuade her. She responded emphatically, "We cannot let violence overcome nonviolence." Furthermore, she informed him that the students had already signed their last wills and testaments. The mild-mannered student activist Bernard Lafayette also knowingly put his life on the line, along with 19 other students in Nashville. With many other freedom riders, he spent the summer of 1961 in a Mississippi jail.
It has the dimension of the spiritual awakening, the spiritual, moral, political, consciousness raising of millions of people who did not know what happened to them, but saw Birmingham, saw the sit-in campaign of 60, saw the Freedom Ride of 61. Each of these movements making an impact, but helping the direct action, nonviolent spirit to emerge and to impact the nation.
The Freedom Ride started in 1961 in Washington, D.C., challenging segregated interstate bus travel in the South. The riders planned to pass through southern states and continue all the way to New Orleans. 2 of the violent attacks in Alabama are represented in this icon, one in Anniston and the other one in Montgomery.
The Children's Campaign of 1963 was an amazing campaign. Martin Luther King had been put in jail, as he had many times over. He was released on $50,000 bail by Harry Belafonte. He went to his colleagues that evening at church, asked how many of them would be willing to go to jail, because that was what it was going to take, and they stood up, and the children stood up. Well, everybody was horrified. Children, sit down. We don't want you hurt. We don't want you involved. Now, Reverend James Bevel said, now, wait a minute. Do we want them to be able to go to a lunch counter and get a hamburger, to go to a playground or a swimming pool? Well, yes. Well, then they're not too young to go to jail. The children were trained thoroughly in civil disobedience and learned for at least a couple of weeks. They were trained. If they were going to protest and possibly go to jail, they needed to know how to protect themselves and not fight back. Well, they started their protest, and sure enough, over 1,000 children were jailed. And you see up here chains that I've used, and the words Children's Campaign, Birmingham, Alabama. And as an artist, I use those little beads, these alphabet beads, which many of us came home from the hospital with, and spelled out those words. The children here, as you see them marching to jail, they're marching towards a lock and a key. Now, the lock is still locked. The key is what they are after, to unlock the segregated world of which they've been a part of.
Medgar Evers was a field secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi, working for fair employment and voting rights. After hearing a pro-civil rights speech by President Kennedy on June 12, 1963, he drove home filled with so much excitement that he forgot the rule. Don't get out of the car on the driver's side, since a gunman might have you in the crosshairs of his gun. Medgar Evers was shot and killed in his own driveway. Myrlie Evers, who gave the invocation at Barack Obama's second inauguration in 2013, is included in this icon with a tear running down her cheek. On August 28, 1963, Reverend Martin Luther King delivered his I Have a Dream speech to over 200,000 civil rights supporters assembled before the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Dr. King's words echo down to us today, most vividly these.
Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Shortly after the march, on September 15, 1963, yet another tragedy occurred. In Birmingham, Alabama, when a bomb placed in a basement window well of this church exploded, killing 4 little girls. In 2004, the Purdys met the parents of Denise McNair, one of the little girls, and the artist presented the McNair family with artwork she had done at Ebony concerning this tragedy.
We asked a very vital question in this country. When didn't we need civil rights? Civil rights are God-given rights that all people and citizens should enjoy. One of the things the exhibit brings out is a significant struggle that people had to go through to just achieve personal and human dignity.
And I think it's cool, like, for young people to actually come here and know about the history. Even my little brother, like, I feel like it's good for him to know where he's coming from and then the people who fought for him, for him to be where he is today. Because if it wasn't for all those people, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, we wouldn't even be here right now. Or we probably...
June 1964, Philadelphia, Mississippi. Andrew Goodman, Michael Schwerner, and James Chaney, all in their 20s, were given permission by the trustees of Mount Zion to use their building for a freedom school. The next day, the building was bombed and burned to the ground. The 3 young men arrived at the site and were devastated by what they saw. The police arrested them for arson. They were released from jail late at night and murdered as part of a plan hatched by Sheriff Cecil Price and Deputy Lawrence Rainey, members of the Ku Klux Klan.
Fannie Lou Hamer was born in 1917, was the granddaughter of a Mississippi slave and youngest of 20 children. At the age of 6, she worked as a sharecropper in the fields with her parents. She was forced to drop out of school in 6th grade to work full-time to help support her family. In spite of such hardships, became a national figure in the movement for civil rights. It wasn't until she was 45 years old that she finally decided to register to vote. On a bus, she, with others, was arrested on false charges and thrown in jail. She became involved in voter registration programs for FCLC and SNCC. In June of '63, Fannie Lou and other civil rights workers were arrested, all in jail. She was beaten with blackjacks while forced to lie face down. Undaunted the next year, she was an organizer of Mississippi's Freedom Summer. Fannie Lou helped form the Mississippi Democratic Party, an alternative to the all-white Mississippi Democratic Party.
Jimmy Lee Jackson's death inspired the march from Selma to Montgomery. On February 18, 1965, in Marion, Alabama, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot and killed while defending his mother from being beaten by a state trooper during a voting rights demonstration. So outraged was the black community that a protest march was planned from nearby Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery. March 7th, 1965. About 600 people, led by John Lewis and Reverend Hosea Williams, attempted to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge to begin the 54-mile journey to Montgomery. They were stopped by state troopers who attacked the marchers. Clubbed and bloodied images were caught on TV, and the event became known as Bloody Sunday. Following Bloody Sunday, Reverend Martin Luther King became involved in the march and put out a call to clergy everywhere to join in a second attempt to cross the bridge. Reverend James Reeb, a Unitarian minister from Boston, responded. The night before the march, Reeb and other colleagues were beaten by a white mob. Reeb died in the hospital 2 days later. Shortly after this incident, President Johnson presented a voting rights bill to Congress. Rabbi Heschel's entire family had been killed by the Nazis, and he knew personally the horrors of racism. One of the leading Jewish theologians and philosophers of the 20th century, Heschel was a mystic and social activist who later influenced Dr. King to come out against the Vietnam War. Viola Liuzzo, a white woman from Detroit, was outraged by the horror of Bloody Sunday. She left her husband and 5 children and headed to Selma in her car. After the march to Montgomery on March 21st, she was transporting marchers back to Selma. On a lonely stretch of road, her car was overtaken by the Ku Klux Klan, who shot and killed her. Jonathan Daniels, an Episcopal seminarian from Cambridge, Massachusetts, also joined the march in Selma and remained there afterwards to continue the work. He was arrested along with other civil rights workers. As they were released from jail after 6 days, they were confronted by a white man wielding a gun. When the gunman pointed the weapon at 16-year-old Ruby Sales, Daniels threw her out of the way, took the bullet himself, and was killed.
There's something sacred about this art. There's something sacred about these people. They're sacred because they are the ones who did it for the rest of us. Making them as icons, a way to revere them in a very special, spiritual kind of way.
Vernon Dahmer was a successful businessman in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and a descendant of both slaves and slave owners. He opened a voting registration booth in his store. In 2004, the artist and her husband stood at the grave of Vernon Dahmer and heard his daughter explain the night the family home was bombed by the Klan. 2 days after the attack, Vernon Dahmer died from the smoke he had inhaled that night. At the time of the bombing, Vernon Dahmer's sons were serving in the United States military. Harlem-born singer and film star Harry Belafonte contributed both time and resources to the civil rights movement and various humanitarian causes. The first musician to have an album sell over 1 million copies worldwide, Belafonte was also the first African American to win an Emmy. My social and political interests are part of my career, he once noted. I cannot separate them. My songs reflect the human condition. The role of art isn't just to show life as it is, but to show it as it should be. As Belafonte's singing and acting talents earned him fame after World War II, he began to participate in demonstrations and raise money for the cause of racial justice. During the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, he and Martin Luther King Jr. became trusted friends. After Dr. King's arrest in Birmingham in 1963, Belafonte posted $50,000 bond for his release. He helped organize and raise money for the Freedom Rides, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and donated large sums to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. After Martin Luther King's assassination, Belafonte served as executor of King's estate. Pamela Chatterton-Purdy chose this iconic image of Coretta Scott King at her husband's funeral in 1968 to emphasize the terrible loss that countless families experienced with the death of their loved ones. Here, Mrs. King comforts one of her children. Free at last. Free at last. On November 4th, 2008, 40 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Barack Obama was elected as the country's first African-American president. This icon is in the shape of the White House. On the left, the artist quotes from the Declaration of Independence, which put forth the American ideals of freedom and the equal rights of all. On the right, the artist quotes from President Obama's now famous speech on race, titled A More Perfect Union, a goal set for America more than 2 centuries ago in the preamble to the United States Constitution. Noting that he stood on the shoulders of the civil rights movement, President Obama challenged all Americans to continue the march of those who came before us, a march for a more just, more equal, more free, more caring America.
But I think what was so critical is that African Americans began a revolution which pointed out that they were the other, and all sorts of other people then, people of a different sexual orientation, women, people of a different religion other than Christianity, began to say, well, we don't like being the other either. And what really happened, I think, here in America is we discovered that the other was us.
More than 50 years have passed since the height of the civil rights movement. Once young people and adults see this art exhibit, they realize how little they knew about the struggle for equal rights and the sacrifices made by those engaged in nonviolent resistance to the unjust laws of only a generation ago. Today there are school children who believe that Martin Luther King was responsible for freeing the slaves and have other fundamental misconceptions about the underlying issues of the civil rights movement. Racism is far more than personal prejudice. It had been literally institutionalized in America. It wasn't until I was over 60 years old, had been involved in civil rights demonstrations, and was the father of 2 adopted black sons, that I learned how deeply embedded racism was in our legal system. As early as the 1600s, the state of Virginia passed laws which essentially declared that African Americans were less than human. They were denied the rights enjoyed by their white neighbors. In his speech on race, President Obama, taking the words of William Faulkner, said that the past isn't dead and buried, it isn't even past. So history continues to live through us. It's important to know it so we can change the future for the better.
On the evening of June 17th, 2015, a stranger was welcomed into the weekly Bible study group meeting at a historic church known as Mother Emanuel. Later, as heads were bowed in a closing prayer, this same young man shot and killed 8 congregants and their beloved pastor. The murderer, a white supremacist, had previously authored a manifesto expressing his hope that this act would start a race war. Investigators discovered photos in which he was proudly surrounded by Confederate flags. In early 2017, a federal court ruled the murderer guilty of the 33 hate crimes with which he had been charged, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. In a stunning example of nonviolence and the transformative power of love, the victims' families ultimately addressed him not with words of hatred or revenge, but with forgiveness and hope. And South Carolina's then Governor Nikki Haley called upon the state legislature to remove the Confederate flag that had still flown in full view of the state capitol more than a century and a half after the Civil War. Marjorie McIver, sister of Myra Thompson, visited the Zion Museum in 2016. She viewed the icons exhibition and spoke with the artist, who decided in that moment to create yet another icon. The Emmanuel 9 icon was dedicated in May 2017 in Marjorie's presence and gifted to the AME Church in Charleston, where it is now on exhibit. Here we see the Reverend Anthony Thompson, husband of Myra Thompson, and the new pastor, the Reverend Eric Manning, standing with the icon in this historic church. The icon illustrates the brutal reality of racism as it continues to exist in America. It also illustrates the progress in our legal system and in the hearts and minds of many Americans since the 1950s and 60s. Urgently as well, this icon and the entire series is a reminder that if progress is to continue, we must face the reality of our history and our present, and be vigilant against forces that are still fighting the very idea of a diverse America.
Buried in my grave and go home to my Lord.